El streaming.
Yeah, hola. Hola, buenas.
Hello, good day. I'm Isabel van Braven, I'm Belgium, and I represent ITAL, a Belgian anti-imperialist movement for peace and international popular sovereignty. We have a big Belgian youth delegation here in Madrid. I'm not here on my own, and I'm one of the eldest. I take pride in saying the future are the young people. So with another association, Breda, and the International Association of the Peoples, the network NATO, and CPPC from Portugal, we've been working closely throughout this year to create a space of sorts to discuss, exchange with international perspective. Because based on why? Because NATO today is global. That's the reality. You know about this concept, global NATO. So working on this reality, this whole process is accelerating. And all wars are cynical, but this war in Ukraine is particularly cynical. We've managed to have a wonderful success in our works. We see what's happening with the war in Ukraine and the consequences around the world, not only in the West, because we must not forget the consequences of militarization of the spirits, the militarization of budgets by many, or that is imposed on many peoples in the south. It is clear that the Ukrainian war has transformed the international context, veering it towards greater confrontation and high-impact global consequences, such as the food and energy crisis. This has attacked the humble peoples around the world, the working class in the West and in the global South. All of them, all of us, are paying for this war. It is all of us who pay with our lives and with our pockets. So before starting this panel, I want to share a brief reflection, and then we'll hear some very interesting analysis. What I wanted to say is this: the war in Ukraine has accelerated a militarization process, and I feel as international movement for peace, we need to accelerate our efforts too, which is why I ask the panelists to not only give us an analysis of the world in order to understand the world so that we can change it, but also to put forward some specific proposals to take action for peace, because we need to make progress. We do not only change the world by understanding it, but we also need to act. It is down to us to act, to change it. I have a wonderful panel here with people from all corners of the world, and I'm going to start giving each panelist 10 minutes to share. We're going to start with Wright. She is from the United States, former colonel, from Veterans for Peace, U.S. activist, and Code Pink activist. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I apologize for the actions of the United States all over the world. We've got a war on the whole world. And we have a war on women with the horrible, horrible decision of the U.S. Supreme Court yesterday on abortion and reproductive rights. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. Don't come to the United States. Boycott the United States. Isolate the United States. Yeah. Well, I'm going to be speaking on a part of the world that really most people aren't interested in. I mean, we've got the conflict going on in Ukraine, but I live in Hawaii, and there's a conflict going on in the Pacific Ocean. I have a whole slide presentation, but we can't play it here. So you can get it on your phone if you go to the website for NATO. But instead, I have human resources. Please come over, and will you sit in front of me while we're... Code Pink Women for Peace, Massachusetts Peace Action. So we have some of the great activist organizations of the United States that are fighting against the empire. Okay, so while the world's attention is focused on Russia and the Ukraine, halfway around the world, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, is Hawaii, where I live, and then the Western Pacific, right on the coast of Asia. Starting this week, in the Pacific, will be the largest naval military exercises, war games in the world. It's called Rim of the Pacific. It will be taking place from June 29th through August 4th. And there will be 26 nations as a part of the naval war games. There will be 25,000 military that will be taking part in it. There will be 26 nations, 38 ships, 170 aircraft, 4 submarines, and there will be 8 nations that will be sending their military forces ashore on the islands of Hawaii. Hawaii should be a sovereign nation, but it was annexed by the United States 125 years ago. So this is very poignant to the people of Hawaii. These forces, the 26 nations, interestingly enough, 45% of the nations that will be participating in RIMPAC come from NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, coming to the Pacific. So we are very upset about that. And some of the RIMPAC, the nations of NATO that are coming to the waters of our Pacific are Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, the UK, Italy. And then there are partners of NATO in the Pacific. You know, the NATO is trying to expand, and we have, you know, our signs here, no NATO expansion. Sweden, Finland here in Europe, well, they're trying to expand it in Asia through the names of partnerships. You know, that's the first step. Just be a partner. Well, so they've got Australia to be a partner, New Zealand to be a partner, Japan to be a partner, South Korea to be a partner. So all of those nations, of course, are participating in this U.S.-NATO Rim of the Pacific military exercises. The red lines that we have, the tension areas in the Pacific, similar to the red lines that are here in Europe, where the Russian government said to NATO and the U.S., we have a red line, and that one of them is the expansion of NATO into Ukraine. Well, rather than NATO and the U.S. saying, okay, we understand the red line, it's not critical to the security of Europe, in my opinion, that Ukraine be a part of NATO. I mean, how many NATO countries are there? 30-something? 30. Yeah, and they're right here, except the one, is there one nation outside of Europe that's a member of NATO? Colombia. Where the hell is that? Oh, pardon. Where is Colombia? It's in Latin America, for God's sakes. A place that I don't think has anything to do with European security, but it certainly has something to do with the U.S. unilateral war on nations in Latin America that don't do what the United States say to, like Venezuela right next door. So NATO is certainly being used as a prop for U.S. imperial interests all over the world, and trying to get first partnerships with the 4 major countries in Asia that will then become a part of NATO. That's the next expansion, will be there. So we've got the red lines that the Russians said, don't you try to bring Ukraine in, because that is one of the things that we know, besides your huge military exercises that NATO has been having along the Russian border for decades, but increasing and more rocket and missile launchers placed right along the border with Russia and Poland and Romania. In Asia, the same sort of thing is happening. The U.S. and NATO is trying to provoke China into some sort of military response. I mean, it seems crazy, doesn't it? Here we have now on Europe a horrific, horrific destruction of a country of Ukraine by war. And yet that's what NATO and the US is trying to do in Asia. They're trying to provoke China. And some of the things they're doing is over the island of Taiwan. The island that the PRC, China, considers as a rogue province, that the US used to recognize, most of the countries of the world used to recognize Taiwan as an independent country, but through a one China policy, which was supposed to lessen tensions with mainland China. And that policy has been in effect for 40 years, 40 years. The same as almost, you know, the Cold War ending here in Europe for 30 years. Peace, maybe not tranquility, but peace and no confrontations that are resulting in loss of life. Well, now in Asia, over Taiwan, the United States has decided that it's going to really start poking at China. So they've sent the highest level diplomats ever in the history of this 40 years. They're starting to send U.S. congressional delegations to Taiwan. They are increasing U.S. military equipment going into Taiwan. Every time a U.S. congressional delegation goes to Taiwan, or a senior diplomat, the mainland Chinese respond. And they respond with armadas of aircraft, of fighter aircraft coming right to the air defense zone of Taiwan. Well, the United States has furnished all sorts of missiles, rockets, artillery that can reach the mainland of China. So what the U.S. is doing is purposely trying to provoke China to respond. The U.S. is also sending through the various waterways, through the South China Sea, through the Straits of Taiwan, up to Japan and Korea, the largest armadas, the largest numbers of ships coming to ply those waters to say freedom of navigation. Well, I agree with that. You know, everybody ought to go through the waters of the world. They shouldn't be closing up. Not that the mainland Chinese have closed up anything, although they have built some military installations on some atolls in contested areas. The United States has 800 military bases outside the U.S. China right now has one, and that's in the Middle East, Djibouti. But then they've started building little islands, and that is causing some concern in the area for sure. Well, the U.S. response, and now part of NATO responding too. Germany, France, the U.K. have all joined with U.S. armadas that are sailing through the South China Sea, through the Straits of Taiwan, Formosa, and going up to Japan. The U.S. has had 2 aircraft carriers off South Korea in the last month and a half. And why would that be? Well, how about the little country called North Korea? A tiny little country with less than 35 million people. Yet because there is still a war going on, that the U.S. has never signed a peace treaty with North Korea because it doesn't want to. It wants to be able to continue to have its military troops, some 50,000 still in Korea. We have 70 bases in Korea. We've got 75 bases in Japan, most of them in Okinawa. We have 6 bases in Australia. It's a big money maker, as you all know. War in the military is a big, big money maker. And so the U.S. wants to keep turmoil going for its military-industrial complex. And that's one of the big, big problems that we have right now, is that big military-industrial complex. And while we will be talking about things of all of Europe through the rest of this panel, I just wanted to make sure that you all knew that it's not just Europe and NATO. NATO has gone to the Pacific. Thank you very much. Thank you.
if you want to see the presentation she made, you can go to peacesummitmadrid.org, and there you can download the whole presentation of Anne Wright. Thank you very much, also respecting perfectly timing. I give the word to Mikaela Erskog, activist from Mozambique, active in the International People's Assembly.
So I twisted Nora, one of the organizers' arms, to play some South African music. I hope some of you heard it earlier, because some of you might know in our political context, we don't start meetings until we've sung for at least 20 minutes, danced, done several chants, called for the abolition of several entities. And so in the interest of time, I think we can call for the abolition of OTAN. So when I say abajo con la OTAN, you say abajo. Yeah? Yeah? You with me? Yeah. Abajo con la OTAN? Abajo! Abajo con la OTAN? Abajo! Thank you. So, I think it was perfect that, Anne, you began, because I'm going to also hate on the US a little bit, and thank you for your apology. I feel the sentiment. Because we know today NATO has become a huge axle in the wheel of this kind of global military-industrial complex that's been controlled essentially by the US empire in its different reinventions for the purpose of a kind of full-spectrum domination, driven, of course, by its ferocious appetite for, economic control and economic hegemony. And, for the African continent, which I'll be talking about more specifically, because, NATO is seen as over here in your North Atlantic area, but we know, in fact, it reaches nearly every part of the globe, is that, of course, recently we've seen with the Ukraine crisis that Africa has become a little bit more in view. We've seen, the racist treatment of students. We, of course, know that the increase in wheat prices is having a huge adverse effect on the African continent, where, out of the 45 low-income countries that depend on a third of their wheat imports coming from Russia and Ukraine, 33 of them are in Africa, right? So that's a huge, huge amount. And those things have come more and more to the fore. But it still has strayed away from talking about some of the deeper, more structural neo-colonial elements that we continue to experience. And so I'm going to talk about four things. NATO's proxy in Africa, which is the Africa Command, the US Africa Command, a bit about its presence and its aims, its consequences, and how we are trying to confront it on the African continent and how we can get your help. So firstly let it be clear that AFRICOM, the Africa Command, which was created in 2007, is a direct product of NATO via the EUCOM, the European Command, because previously the European Command was in charge of the African continents, or interacting with the African continents. And it was the former commander of EUCOM, who was also the operational forces leader of NATO, who made this proposal in 2004 or so. And so there's a direct relationship, like a guy who sits both in EUCOM and NATO was like, we need this thing called Africa Command to secure certain political and economic interests on the continent. And so just to give you a sense of things, we have Africa Command has at least 29 bases, official bases. They also have, lily pads and unofficial bases. And we see the more clandestine forms of these bases in all but name, in examples like in Ghana. In 2018, they signed a certain memorandum of agreement that essentially allowed for US soldiers to use, and they say, unimpeded access and use of Kotoka International Airport. The soldiers were allowed to, or are continuously allowed to, carry their arms even when they're wearing civilian clothing. If they commit a crime, they don't have to be held in the court. They have diplomatic immunity. And even Brigadier General Leonard Kaczynski said in 2019 that essentially the weekly flights that were going from the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, bringing supplies to Africa, thanks Germany, was basically, he called it basically a bus route to West Africa. So they treat this, international airport, which should be sovereign property in the interest of the people of Ghana, as their personal bus route to the rest of the continent. And then in terms of their actual qualitative role on the continent, we've seen increasingly, and it's so apparent that's a sad part. It's so apparent that the US military operates not only to provide, advantages to the United States and its, ruling elite, but it also functions with the armies of NATO countries like France as a guarantor of various Western corporate interests. For example, as mentioned, maybe nobody mentioned it earlier, but the biggest drone base, where is it? I'm sure many of you know, the biggest drone base in the world.
Rammstein. Djibouti.
Niger. Niger. Close. Outside of Europe. Yeah. The biggest foreign military base outside of the NATO countries is in Niger, which is a US drone base that conveniently is located next to France's foreign military base in Agadez, which is very close to one of the biggest uranium deposits. And this uranium deposit, I still find it like astronomically depressing that the uranium generated from this one or two mines from this one town are able to power 1 in 3 French light bulbs. 1 in 3. Meanwhile, the populations of Niger, the people of Niger, it's around, and this is a generous figure, 1 in 7 have access to electricity. That's not guaranteed, but have access of some kind. So they continue to operate, of course, as these like guarantors of various corporate interests, at, of course, the huge destruction of the environment, of the African people, exploitation. But the worst part is they are using their presence or justifying their presence under so-called jihadist terrorist violence. They said, we're coming here because of the conflict. When in fact, it's well documented by UN rapporteurs, by various institutions, by the CIRPs of the world, that since AFRICOM was formed, we've seen a massive increase of jihadist violence. When they destroyed Libya in 2011, they essentially opened the floodgates for this rampant instability. And so on the one hand, we have the consequence of increased violence. On the other, as we saw in Libya in 2011, we have a total undermining of the sovereignty of African countries. In March 2011, literally the day before the Peace and Security Council of the African Union was going to be deployed to Tripoli, NATO enacted the first bombings. And of course, African leaders were extremely disappointed. Even the most right conservative saw it as an affront to the sovereignty of the continent. But ultimately, since that moment, we've seen a huge deterioration of the influence, the credibility of the African Union. And so that's another huge consequence. The African Union doesn't serve the interests of the people, which, frankly, it didn't since like the ousting of Nkrumah in 1968, but any kind of potential it had, because it had a very concrete and credible plan in terms of ending the war in Libya, that was completely undermined. The number two, which relates to what Anne was saying and to all of you in this room, is number two, the US and NATO's indirect proxy presence through AFRICOM is a form of creating a buffer zone, not only to the east in terms of pushing back China's influence, but of course the actual border. You've essentially exported the border lower and lower into the African continent, where we now have to deal with the refugee crisis, even though you continue to take, and when I say you, I don't mean you directly, I mean you the European project. And elites. So essentially we have this buffer zone that's been created that, again, undermines our ability to create independent relationships, even with the Chinese. And we're not under any illusions. It's always very patronizing that the West will say, I think it was Anthony Blinken last year, told African leaders that beware of China, they're coming to get you. And we find it extremely patronizing because at this point in history, we actually have options. We actually have options. And that's totally different from about 30, 40 years ago, where we didn't have options. We had to come and, beg at the table for the few breadcrumbs we could get to use our own resources and our own labors. And so I think also for us, when we're now trying to think about the security question or this kind of militarization of the continent, for us, we often have to confront these issues in terms of their actual structural base, which more and more we're doing through platforms like, I'm part of the International People's Assembly, and I'm part of Pan-Africanism Today, which coordinates the regional articulation. And in 2018, in Winneba, Ghana, we met for the first time on the African continent, over 400 participants from trade unions, socialist parties, progressive groups, peasant movements, student unions were meeting in the same place to define a common platform based on wanting to rebuild a sense of people's Pan-Africanism that we would want to push for advancing our different campaigns, because for us, and I'm sure many of you have mentioned in different panels, the question of security is not one of abstractions. It's about the material reality. Social security is a question of peace. If we don't have education, if we're not feeding ourselves, if we're not living in proper conditions, there can be no peace. It's not something on an international, abstract level about common security strategies. It's about how do we change our societies where the social wealth produced by the working class, the social resources that should be in common, are actually going back into the people. And so, which is why, for example, China, and I'm not paid by the CCP to say any of this, but they have a qualitatively different security approach on the continent because, for example, in the Horn of Africa, which many of you will hear about conflicts happening in the Horn, whilst the US is sending arms, military personnel, they're building water pipelines, they're building infrastructure, things that would allow for human beings not to want to move into a violent form of confronting the state. In the same way in Mozambique, apparently the northern jihadist group is said to be with ISIS. No evidence have been found of that. Most of the people who are involved in it, they have a charismatic leader, and most of the people involved are young, unemployed African men who need certain social security. So if we're going to confront the question of violence and security, we have to deal with the economic and social context we find ourselves in. So I will end with perhaps, because I'm way over time, right?
No, 30 seconds.
I will end with, so I also work in Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and we have several materials you can check out in the reception of room 1. But one of the things that we're hoping that everyone can read is this plan to save the planet, which was produced with ALBA TCP, the Simon Bolivar Institute, as well as various research institutes that are part of our network. And it's not some radical, seize the means of productions type document. It's very basic things that shock you are absent from the UN Charter, that the Soviet Union had put on the table many years ago, but apparently, we can't get things like free, equality, decolonized education. And one of the things we raise in this is that we have to prevent the use of the security paradigm, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, to address the world's social issues. Like, we need to address them from the level of working class organized struggles that deal with bread and butter issues with, of course, this oversight of what is happening geopolitically. And that's where we find ourselves on the African continent, trying to connect those dots so that we can ultimately free ourselves from colonialism. So today is Mozambique's Independence Day. And before I leave you with a quote from the great Samora Machel, who was a freedom fighter and leader of the National Liberation Movement, I want to mention one fact and then something about solidarity, is that right now the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, 98% of its funds come from foreign donors. And I think a huge chunk of that comes from the European Union. And so whilst you guys are struggling with the very many dimensions of European politics, many of you are in the European Left Party, I urge you that when those kinds of things come onto the table, you think about what then it means for the African people and our own concerns and our own project for development. Because I don't think if we understand that your struggles are linked to our struggles, we of course aren't going to succeed. So lastly, is what Samora Machel said, just so we don't forget, is that international solidarity is not an act of charity. It is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains towards the same objectives. And so I'm glad that in meetings like this, we can share and explore the different terrains and hopefully are guided by the same objective, which for some of us, we call it socialism, others call it liberation. But I hope that we'll find some way through this in the near future.
Thank you very much. Also for the final words were very inspiring. I give the word to Reiner Braun. He's a renowned peace activist representing the No to NATO network and also active at the International Peace Bureau.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. You know what to say after these two brilliant speeches. First of all, I would say, and Europe have also to excuse by the United States, or by you, for following your stupid politics always, and be a part of this junior partner of this militarism. And I think it is a shame that the governments in Europe are tremendously following this line, enlarging their military budgets, and always play a role as the smaller brother of the United States imperialism. And I think this is definitely the wrong way to peace. And this unites us, I think, in our common struggle against these military developments all over the world. And we should not forget that the European Union has their own military interests. The European Union, and Ukraine is the best example for this, is on one side following the US rules and US guidelines, but on the other side they also want to be a European Union military superpower with own interests, above all in Africa, saving the resources which we were taking for more than 500 years from this continent, and the enlargement of the military infrastructure and the military budgets also in Europe is to develop the European Union as a military superpower. And I think this is also a very important point for us to argument and to oppose against NATO. Let me say two words to NATO expansion. I think Anne described that NATO, the word NATO, is a lie. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is definitely not any longer true. NATO is the military alliance in the world, the biggest military alliance history had ever seen. And Anne mentioned the expansion to Asia, and I think we can add Indonesia, we can add the specific agreement with Philippines and other countries. We can add all the military exercises NATO is doing around China, that we can see on one side that NATO is definitely enlarging to Asia, but also including the fifth continent. What is AUKUS? AUKUS is the start of the Asian NATO. We should never forget that. So we have a new military alliance in Asia, and what will be the future of other military alliances in Asia, we will see. I see that the biggest danger of war, and I know how dangerous is Ukraine, the biggest danger for a worldwide nuclear war is Asia, above all the conflict around Taiwan. And this could be the third world war and the end of human beings. So we as peace movements much more pay attention for these conflicts, above all as European peace movements. We have never done this enough in the past, and I think when we now discussing before the NATO summit, the new NATO as the military alliance of the world, we have also discussed the new peace alliance of the world. And this includes the question why they are doing this. Why NATO is spending 60% of all the military budgets of the world. 60% of 2 trillion. This is more than $1 trillion US per year. And you know, hunger, sovereignty, climate problems, all these problems are not phasing. And I will come back to this a little bit later. So why they are doing this? And for me, the main reason is that we have a tectonic change of the international power structure. We have losing powers in the world, and we have new powers which are upcoming and want to be more independent, more strong, accepted in the world. The powers which are reducing their influence in the world is above all the United States of America. We can give a lot of examples. In former times, 2 to 40% of the world world income was coming from the United States. Now it's 19%. The same with the European Union. The second loser of the international power structure is Europe. And who are the winners? Who are the new powers? This is above all China. China is the most important economic partner, is enlarging their influence all over the world, is one of the richest countries when you look into the financial resources and financial reserves, is one of the highest developed technology countries in the world. So, but this is not only China, these are also India, this is Brazil and other countries, including South Africa. These change of power structures, these countries which are reducing their influence don't want to reduce their influence. They are fighting for their influence and their strong positions. They are fighting to be again dominant in the world. And this fight is now the key point of this fight, the war where you can see this fight day to day, is Ukraine. Because Ukraine is a very key country between Europe and Asia. And the influence and dominance in Ukraine creates the dominance over Eurasia and the influence over Eurasia. And this is why the US is spending $5 trillion under Nuland to Ukraine. This is why the US government and the European Union forced the Ukrainian government not to accept Minsk II, not to negotiate, and that now they want to continue the war so long till the last Ukrainian died. That is the reason, a deeper reason for this war, and you know, the illegal attack of Russia even makes this for the European Union and the US a little bit easier. A second point I think which we should have in mind when we are discussing about NATO. NATO is a war machine which creates day-to-day emissions and destroy the environment. When the Pentagon would be a state, it would be by the climate emissions under place number 49, before Sweden, before Denmark, before Portugal. So it is a killing machine for the environment. And the enlargement of NATO, the enlargement of the military budget will even create more emissions, will destroy more environment, and will make it is impossible to come to the 1.5 goal of the Paris Charter. I think we should forget this goal. It will never happen. The emissions we are putting in the air during the last 2 years, you will see in the next years, and then we will over 1.5%. But for saving the environment, we need to overcome NATO. When we are speaking about coming to zero, I think the first point where we can come to zero is military, close military. And we reduce a big amount of emissions and destroying the climate and the environment. And the second point is, can you imagine that we can solve environmental questions when we are in such a confrontation in the world, when the big superpowers are fighting against each other? The background for solving environmental and all global problems, including sustainable development goals, is cooperation. So we need cooperation, and cooperation is impossible with the aggressive NATO. So we need an alternative security structure, which includes climate change, which includes fight against poverty and hunger, and this is common security. And the International Trade Union Confederation, IPB, and the Olaf Palme Institute developed the new Olaf Palme report, which we will present in the evening, so I will not tell this yet. I was asked at the end, this is my third part, to speak about actions. And you know, I'm so happy I'm coming directly from the airbase Ramstein, from the protest actions which take place at the airbase Ramstein against the biggest US airbase outside of the United States and the only airbase where all the drones attacks are controlled and get the final order to their goal. So airbase Ramstein is a key element in the war. And today, you can see day to day, minute to minute, the airplanes flying to Ukraine, bringing all the military equipment to Ukraine. So our protest, the German protest against the airbase with international support was very important. And today, we have, how we call this, G7 summit? No. I think it's better to call Economic NATO Summit. Yes. This summit is taking place now, and this summit is responsible for what Anne and my colleague next to me was describing. Poverty, hunger, unjust trade conditions, exploitation of the poor people. And we, at the same minute I'm speaking here, the big manifestation in Munich starts, with hopefully more than 40,000 people. That is the protest we need. And I hope to the protest of tomorrow. and saying at the end what we need. I know that we have differences between us. We have many discussions between us. That's great. But I think we have more points together than points which are separate us. And let us put these points together in the fight against militarism, against war, for disarmament, for social justice in an environmental healthy world. I think this should unite us, and I hope from this Madrid summit we will go a sign for more common actions in the world. We need this, and we are the actors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reiner. I give the floor now to Ulla Klötzer from Finland, and active with Women Against Nuclear Power.
And Women for Peace.
And Women for
They
Peace.
are sister organizations.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, it's also, we have sister organizations, Women Against Nuclear Power and Women for Peace, because nuclear power and nuclear weapons are Siamese twins. They belong together. So they have to be fought, both of them. But first of all, I would say that after these three speakers, I could pack my things and go home. But I will stick to my paper and try to give you a perspective from the north. But first of all, I would like to say that the war in Ukraine is devastating, and it must come to an end before it ends the world. But will it be possible? That's the question. As long as common people really have no clue about the perspective, what has been taking place since the Second World War. And I would say, excuse me, Anne, that this war is a mad and satanic plan of the US to increase the full spectrum dominance in the world. That has been talked about many, many times. That has been built up with the help of NATO for years. And that plan is that Russia must be brought to its knees, and then the turn comes to China. First came the expansion of NATO from some handful of members in 1948, when I was born, to 30 members today. And this despite very prominent Western promises from Germany, the US, the UK, and so on, after the fall of the Berlin Wall about NATO, not going 1 inch to the east. And now even the Pope says that NATO is knocking on Moscow's door. Then there was the disastrous mistake not to get rid of NATO when the Warsaw Pact was ended. That was really disastrous. And one more recent, most important puzzle piece was the Maidan coup in Ukraine, 2014, engineered by the US, and NATO.
I give up.
And now we have the Ukraine war setting two crucial missing puzzle pieces right in the northern NATO region. The NATO applications of Finland, my home country, and Sweden, initiated by the Ukraine war. I think it was deliberate. And Finland last December signing the buying of F-35 fighter jets. A satanic plan that was actually realized overnight. In 2021, 21% of the Finnish people supported NATO. In March 2022, the supporters amounted to 62%. The NATO process, starting immediately after the Ukraine intervention, is a masterpiece of totalitarian consensus dictatorship. What comes to politicians and the media? The President of Finland, all political parties, and the media above all, turned into NATO supporters overnight. Only the left party tried to keep some somewhat skeptical view, but also this party turned rather quickly into a NATO supporter. No democratic debate about negative effects. No articles about alternatives, or prominent persons or groups speaking out against a further NATO expansion, like Erskog, who was the one who brought Watergate into the opinion, into the public, and fell the Nixon regime. Nothing about increasing tensions, increasing risks for nuclear war, etc. This despite the Green Party Foreign Minister, Pekka Haavisto. He spoke great words when Finland became a member of the UN Human Rights Council in October 2021. He said in a press release that he and Finland would work for peace and understanding and integrating civil society and NGOs in decision making. We had nothing to say in this debate. Also, the President of Finland, Niinistö, had promised several times to have referendums. That was forgotten. Of course, with 62% saying yes, it would have been crazy. Women for Peace sent out a list of warnings. We started in February, with a list of all these good examples of how we could somehow get over the tensions between West and Russia. Nothing. We sent it to 72 chief editors of the television and the newspapers. We sent it to all ministers and all parliamentarians. Then we sent out a list of warnings with all these Daniel Ellsberg, etc., 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 Chomsky, and so on. Nothing. No reactions. Now, before we left, the day before, we sent the next list with a lot of but there is no debate in the media. And since there was no democratic debate and no free media, the Finnish people turned, I would say, in a matter of weeks, into totally blind and deaf NATO supporters. And the really shameful part, this happened in Finland as well as Sweden, under the rule of social democrats, and above all, women social democratic prime ministers. I was ashamed that I am a woman. And in Finland, with the 99% help of the Green and the Left Party. Not in Sweden, they were more critical. Now, of course, of this Russia is acting. According to recent news, Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu announced that new military bases will be established in the western part of the country near the Finnish border. Finland has the longest border to Russia in Europe. Finland has a very strong defense. We do not need NATO. NATO needs us. They need our military sources. They need us to be the target. How could this happen? Finland has had, we were a non-aligned country since, non-aligned of course in brackets with partnership and so on, but still after the Second World War. We had a rather well-functioning relationship with Russia for decades. Trade and business benefited, and we had a dialogue of understanding. Finnish people understood that we shouldn't get very noisy with a big neighbor. And as late as last spring, 2021, Finland's president, who is proudly now bringing both Finland and Sweden into NATO because it was Finland who pushed Sweden, he wanted to arrange a big, fancy OSCE meeting in Helsinki 2025 as the 50th anniversary of the big Helsinki conference. No. Exploded. He even braved in the newspapers that he had the support of Moscow and Washington and Berlin and Beijing. And at the security conference in Munich in 2019, the same president, after the tragic announcement that the US would withdraw from the INF treaty, he speculated of the possibility of extending the treaty in regards to Europe. He talked about a region reaching from the Ural Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. All disappeared in the air overnight. And all this was obviously too much for the US and NATO. They did really not want to have an OSCE conference where Russia and all ones would sit at the same table. They really didn't want it, the success of Helsinki in 1975. And the two missing pieces had to be brought in, and they were brought in. The ironic and deeply tragic fact is that, you know what? Only the Turkish president, the tyrannical human rights abuser and violator, now might stop these memberships. I find this guy disgusting, but if he can stop Finland from going into NATO, I would maybe even thank him. But of course, this crazy tyrannical guy, he can be bought by anything. He can be bought by EU membership. He can be bought by Finland and Sweden changing their laws so that these terrible terrorists, which we find are refugees, can be turned back to Turkey and put into jail. Or he could get the weapon embargoes lifted or whatever. How to proceed? I think we shall not give up the thought of a new OSCE conference. We should push the Austrians, still non-aligned, or the Irish, still non-aligned, or even Switzerland, non-Ireland, or even Moscow.
Malta.
Yeah, Malta, right, to have an OSCE conference in 2025. We shall work for that. We have had two big lists appeals, Women for Peace in Finland, with brilliant organizations that have signed them. We can call them all together again, and we can get more organizations to sign, and we have to have all the languages. And we have to network. The problem is language. When we have had these OSCE appeals, we couldn't get signatures. We have signatures from Russia because we got them translated by our friend. But for instance, the Spanish ones were a problem. So we have to get all the documents translated. And then what I want to say that the sanctions, when the sanctions were announced, I thought, oh, bloody hell, this is terrible. Now I think it's rather good, because now they are shooting themselves in their feet. Because now the people of Europe also get to know what the sanctions are all about. And I was so happy that the day before I came here, I found this beautiful. It's a Europe-wide think tank situated in Berlin. It's called the European Council of Foreign Relations. They made an opinion poll in 10 EU countries. And according to this opinion poll, the ones that want to bring Russia on their knees, they are 22%. The ones that are labeled peace, they are 35%. Then they have a big group of what they call swing voters, but the most part of the swing voters are leaning into peace. And it's because of these sanctions and so on, and they see where it's leading. So that would make 61%. And this think tank is also warning that what is going on now is bringing a cleft, a division between the political elite and the decision makers and the people, and that we have to use. And I would end by saying that NATO is a nuclear-armed terror organization which we have to fight.
Thank you, Ulla. I personally learned a lot. So we always think about Europe, but even Europe, the North, has some different, very interesting things to say that we need to include in our discussions and our debates. I give the last panelist the floor. He is Gregorio Piccin.
Right.
Yes, from the Peace Working Group of the European Left Party.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, comrades. I'm very glad to be with you today. I'm going to speak about depleted uranium as a war crime today in Ukraine and yesterday also in Serbia and Kosovo, where NATO is invoking immunity. Excuse me for my Italo-English. I try to be clear. Well, Interpol Secretary General Jürgen Stock recently stated that the abnormal amount of weapons circulating in Ukraine is already becoming the object of criminal and mafia trafficking. Criminals are already focusing on these weapons, he said. Even weapons used by the military, heavy weapons, will be available on the criminal market. The criminals I'm talking about operate globally, so these weapons will be traded between continents, Stock said. Everything that is transportable will be a potential object of this traffic in Europe and beyond. Not only rifles and pistols, but various weapons of war, including portable anti-craft and anti-tank missiles. The news seems to have shaken the faith in Ukrainian rearmament of Draghi government and almost the entire parliament of my country. The fact that Ukraine is becoming the center of an international arms trade is described by the realpolitik as a side effect. But this side effect may not be the only one. Among the weapons shipped from the arsenals of several NATO countries to Ukraine, and which we may find on our streets, are the Milan portable anti-tank missiles, made by a France and Germany joint venture. The old models of these missiles, part of the transfers in question, have a targeting system that contains and releases thorium, a highly radioactive heavy metal. In the NATO polygons of Capo Teulada and Quirra in Sardinia, thousands of them have been fired with devastating consequences for the environment and health. It was precisely at the court of Cagliari in Sardinia that the last 10th of June, the trial for environmental disaster in the Capo Teulada area began, involving five generals of the Italian armed forces. It turns out that the missiles in question were sent to Ukraine not only by France, but also by Italy. While in France, Macron has officially declared it, in Italy the Draghi government follows the line of state secret, an open secret to tell the truth, since the sending of these weapons has already been leaked. Last 21st of June, the Prime Minister gave us no answer to a specific parliamentary question we addressed to him. Government and almost all parliaments want to go on with these irresponsible sendings. The NATO countries' armed solidarity with Ukraine is turning out to be what it really is, namely a good way to empty the arsenals of old weapons and, in some cases, even capable of releasing a lingering legacy of death, as has already happened in almost all the countries where radioactive and cancerous democracy has been exported: Iraq, Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. The same Leopard tanks that Germany has decided to send to do its part can fire the depleted uranium ammunition used by the US Abrams tanks. And it is very likely that such munition will arrive in Ukraine, included in the amazing 20 billion package that Biden has recently allocated. On the opposite front, it is just as likely that the Russian armed forces are also using depleted uranium bullets. It was 4 years ago that the Russian Defense Ministry decided to modernize its T-80BV tanks so that they could fire ammunition containing the deadly metal. A sort of so-and-so adaptation in an international context where these weapons, unlike chemical, bacteriological and nuclear ones, are not yet formally banned. Ukraine is therefore turning into yet another battlefield where the war, when it ends, will leave a dowry of veritable epidemic of depleted uranium and other radioactive heavy metals. An epidemic that will affect over the years both the soldiers in all fronts and the civilians who will continue to live in the contaminated territories. There are precedents that unfortunately do not bode well and are purposely ignored by policymakers and military leadership. The United States, the United Kingdom and NATO, after having scattered hundreds of tons of depleted uranium from the Middle East to the Balkans over 30 years of belligerence, continue to turn their backs on both their own soldiers who have fallen ill or died from exposure to this metal and on the thousands of civilians who, in a far greater numbers, follow the same fate. In Serbia today, NATO is under indictment in the Belgrade High Court for causing a depleted uranium epidemic that continues to kill civilians. Before talking about Serbia, we must start a little bit from Italy. In fact, NATO fighter bombers took off from Italy and throughout the 90s with thousands of sorties over Bosnia and Yugoslavia. They disseminated at least 16 tons of depleted uranium. Then the sending of troops to those same contaminated territories for so-called peacekeeping. Among the Italian soldiers who returned from missions in the Balkans and Iraq, there are at least 400 dead and 8,000 seriously ill from exposure to the heavy metal. Thanks to the almost 300 verdicts won by the lawyer Angelo Fiore Tartaglia, legal representative of the military victims, not only has the Ministry of Defense had to face up to its direct responsibility, but the correlation between serious tumors and exposure to depleted uranium has become cause law. A unique case in Europe, I think, and in the world. It took 20 years, but then the echo of this unprecedented legal battle reached Serbia, where in the meantime the cancer incidence in the contaminated areas has skyrocketed to 200% with a drastic drop, the age on onset of tumors and peak of cases among the population under 50. A pool of lawyers led by the lawyer Sergeant Aleksic with the decisive support of Tartaglia has filed the first lawsuits against NATO in the Belgrade High Court. Thousands are in fact the civilian victims of the environmental disaster unleashed by the alliance. More than a year after the filing of the first lawsuit, NATO has made it known that it does not intend to answer in the court for its responsibilities, claiming immunity and the fact that there has been an agreement between the alliance and Serbia to this effect in force since 2005. In a letter sent to the Belgrade High Court, which lawyer Tartaglia provided to us, NATO states that will not participate in the trials and expects that the status, privilege and immunities enjoyed by the organization will be fully accepted by the Serbian authorities, including the courts. NATO expects the Serbian government to take all necessary steps to recognize and give effect to the status enjoyed by the organization at the High Court of Belgrade. But the lawyers representative of the victims do not agree. We have responded to NATO's claims with a court response. Tartaglia tells us. First of all, the 2005 agreement with the Serbian government is subsequent to the disputed facts and in any case concerns immunity for personnel operating on Serbian territory. Furthermore, the lawyer continues, it seems to us inadmissible that NATO should ask for immunity for a documented series of war crimes. It also seems to us a sign of great arrogance that NATO is demanding that the government intervene with the court to cover everything up. We are going ahead, European legal culture is at stake here. That's what he said. One thing is certain, I think. The jurisprudence on depleted uranium built up in Italy and the lawsuits in Serbia have already become an indispensable part of the fights to nail NATO to its proclaimed war responsibilities and of the more general struggle to definitely ban the use of these weapons, Ukraine included. I think it is urgent that this Assembly proposes to include in the final document a shared commitment of both the European left and the movements participating in the peace summit. 2, first, request NATO governments to block any arms shipments to Ukraine in favor of a policy aimed at negotiations between the parties. Second, promote a humanitarian initiative directed at the conflicting parties in Ukraine to demand the suspension and no use of heavy metals weapons. And third, last but not least, promote an initiative headed to the United Nations to ban all weapons and weapon systems that use heavy metals such as thorium and depleted uranium. Thank you.
Again, thank you. I learned a lot. I think you too. We will end this conference before we go to the questions with we wanted to have some Ukrainian and Russian peace activists with us. It was, as always, not possible, but they will be with us online. There's a project, Give Peace a Chance, Voices for Peace from Ukraine and Russia, and we will see a conversation between Yuri Sheliazhenko from the Ukrainian Pacifist movement and the Russian activist Oleg Bodrov. We will try it out if it works.
Yeah, welcome Oleg Bodrov from St. Petersburg and Yuri Sheliazhenko from Kiev. Welcome to our small Zoom conference. Yuri and Oleg, you are both
It's important not only to understand the world, to change it, but also to act for peace. We call upon all the people here to go to the demonstration tomorrow in Atocha. Let's be with a lot of us. We need to know, we need to be not only a peace summit against the war summit, but also a peace movement reclaiming the streets against all the corporations and economic and political elites in the world. Thank you. Also important, we need to have a peace culture, and that's why we also made some amazing posters, and maybe you can see some of them there, I don't know, but even you can see them downstairs. Take some pictures, print it out and bring it with you in the Peace Summit if you don't have your slogans or your animation ready, because it's not only important we are visible with people, but also with our messages, or slogans and or animation. So let's be loud in Madrid tomorrow. It's not possible to start with the video. I give the floor to some questions, if they are. It is important when you do the questions, you go sit there. They told me, and you put up the question very loud, is because of the streaming, I think. So if you want to ask something, go to the floor and ask whatever you want to this amazing panel. There was someone with a mic normally here, but I don't know.
They use that one at the
Maybe. You can. Yeah.
Can you use the speaker's mic?
Dear friends, my best greetings from Brussels, Belgium, from the Belgium-Korean Friendship Association, who is a member of the International Peace Organization. First, my constatation: I was in Kiev in 2014 and in Lugansk also in 2014. Short.
Sorry.
And my question is, how do you see the beginning of the war, and how do you see the movement of the people of Lugansk and Donetsk that in 2014 has risen up, stood up, and asked independence to create the independent People's Republic of Lugansk and the independent Republic of Donetsk?
Thank you. Is there someone more one question? We will assemble some questions and then the different panelists will answer. Maybe you can go.
Hi everybody, my name is Alain Rouy. I am from the French Mouvement de la Paix, peace movement in France. I want to come back to Macron. There is no illusion to have about Macron. You remember he said NATO was dead, cerebral death, but he's a very big liar. It was only a smoke screen. It's the same when Macron speaks from European autonomy, strategic autonomy. It's absolutely not the truth. France is more involved than ever in NATO. The first time since years we have US troops in French harbors. It was for the maneuver Defender 2020. It was the first time since de Gaulle that we have lower. That's
asking questions, sorry. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And also it was only what I want to say, no illusion. France is more involved in NATO than ever, and there is no trust to have. And I wanted to reinforce the opinion for common security, but we can speak later about it.
Thank you, Alain.
Thank you.
I was just going to talk about what's happening in Britain. So it's not a question, but first of all, I wanted to say how fantastic this panel has been. It's really amazing, really inspiring, and also it's really great to be here. So my name's Sophie Bolt. I'm from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in Britain. We send solidarity greetings from Britain. In a couple of hours, there's going to be a protest as part of this No to NATO weekend. It won't be anywhere near as huge as what's happening in Germany, but we're doing our bit. So I just really wanted to update you a little bit on the situation. So obviously Britain is like one of the most hawkish NATO states, completely pro-US, and it's sort of been absolutely desperate really to have an excuse for increasing its nuclear warheads and its defence spending, which is now third largest in the world, and obviously it's now part of the AUKUS partnership. It completely fanned the flames of a military confrontation between Ukraine and Russia when Europe, was actually sort of trying to, avert it. And as part of this sort of US sort of military offensive that we're seeing in Europe now, this massive sort of building up of sort of NATO bases across Europe in order to confront Russia and wider, it looks like US nuclear bombs are going to be based in Britain again. Lakenheath, which is on the east coast of Britain, it's basically sort of a US air base for F-15 and F-35 fighter jets. So we had a big campaign against this base and against sort of the nuclear weapons being based there, and eventually they were actually removed in 2008. So we are now building up that campaign again. We had a first protest just last month, which was, pretty successful, and we've got another protest planned on Saturday, the 17th of September, as part of the US nukes out of Europe action that's taking place in September. It'd be really great if we can kind of coordinate with other anti-base campaigns, so that maybe we can have something on the same day, but just really to kind of link up with you and to get sort of inspiration, so we can kind of show that there's a coordinated response to this, just as there is, like, this kind of coordinated offensive by the US. And then just finally, just in terms of, like, what's your position like in Britain? I mean, these whole sort of contradictions that people have been sort of raising in relation to the conflict. People were, like, terrified that there's going to be a nuclear war, and that's definitely happening in Britain. And we've got a situation where a whole new generation of basically sort of young people are now kind of alert to this existential threat, which they weren't before. And we've seen an increase in our membership, so we're doing absolutely everything possible to really kind of galvanize those people. Our job is also that we've got to show them that it's NATO that puts us on the front line. This whole issue around, like, NATO makes you safe, complete opposite. And also it's completely driving the economic crisis that, people have been talking about. That is a political choice by our governments, and more larger sections of the population are wanting solutions. And I think the huge military budgets are going to become even harder to justify with no resolution to the conflict in the Ukraine. We know that there has got to be a political settlement, a negotiated political settlement to end that conflict. Escalation is only going to sort of continue it. So I think that the peace movement offers real, like, tangible, concrete solutions to the many crises that we face today. We're definitely, like, redoubling our efforts in Britain, now more than ever, and we really are excited about working with all of you here to make sure that, like, those actions in September will be fantastic. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
They informed me that we can try the video again, so we propose to give the video to you now, if it works.
Yeah, welcome, Oleg Bodrov from St. Petersburg and Yuri Sheliazhenko from Kiev. Welcome to our small Zoom conference. Yuri and Oleg, you are both engaged in this war because your countries are engaged in the war. What are your impressions after 100 days, or quite 100 days of war, with the day-to-day danger of further escalation? What do you think? What could be the steps for a more peaceful world which you can present to us? Maybe Yuri, you start, and then Oleg, you are the next.
Well, certainly we need to build such a massive peace movement like in the end of 20th century, when peace-loving humankind managed to prevent nuclear war. To take the streets throughout the world, in Russia, in Europe, in the United States, in China, to protest against reckless and dangerous great power politics. Military competition between Russia and USA for control over Ukraine torn apart my country, and it should be stopped. It already increased global famine, inflation, and universal decline in social and environmental welfare. We should not allow continuing weapons supply, economic warfare, and hate campaigns to push the world into the abyss of nuclear war. We should demand immediate ceasefire and comprehensive peace talks to stop the bloodshed between Russia and Ukraine, as well as other protracted wars against the world. To abandon Armageddonic megalomania of great powers and militant nationalisms of their clients. To ensure worldwide transition to a nonviolent society. To achieve perpetual peace, it is not enough to resolve Ukraine-Russia conflict at the negotiation table rather than on the battlefield. All other ongoing wars should be stopped, and foreseeable wars should be prevented in the same manner, which means that we should spend more public money on diplomacy and peace culture than we spend on the military. And military spending should be gradually decreased with development of nonviolent global security system, peaceful governance, and nonviolent conflict management. Military patriotic upbringing and conscription, such as in Russia and Ukraine, should be prohibited by international law. Intensive peace-building dialogue can rebuild trust and cooperation among Western and Eastern leaders, elites, and civil societies. Question of abolition of nuclear weapons should be at the center of this dialogue. Step by step, possession of atomic and hydrogen weapons, strategies of preparation for a nuclear war, and threats of war should be made immoral and unacceptable for public opinion around the world. Merchants of death profiting from mutual assured destruction doctrine, like American military-industrial complex and their marketing department, the NATO, spend a lot of money to advertise their doomsday machine as the only realistic mechanism of international order. But we know that the world managed to enact the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And we know that if all countries will sign it, all the nukes will be scrapped forever. It is a very realistic, practical, and common sense scenario, and whole humankind should commit to abolition of nuclear weapons. It is a question of survival.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you very much for this introduction and answering my first question. Oleg, the floor is to you.
Thank you, colleagues. First of all, I'd like to say thank you, Yuri, because I support all your ideas. And it's nice because we are from the country which is now have military conflict, but it is illustration that we have propaganda of the war in our countries. And in Russia, state propaganda promote that idea that we have enemy everywhere. So ordinary people from the Western countries is our enemies. But your message now show that it is not true. And I think it is main problem in that politicians of Russia and NATO countries are dividing ordinary people. What can we do in this case? First of all, I think reasonable if we involve a new generation from Russia and NATO countries in the joint projects. For example, some months ago, we organized a photo exhibition of the students from Russia and the United States. The name of this exhibition was Our Favorite Places of the Coast of the Gulf of Finland and Atlantic Coast. So it was very interesting that the students and new generation have no any barrier for communications, and it was nice to feel that we are part of one society on our planet. So I think we need to involve new generation for the communications and discussion of our common goals. And it will be like alternative of the strategy, which is realized the politicians of NATO countries and Russia. And one of the idea, maybe very practical idea, what do you think? Maybe reasonable to organize common press conference dedicated to the appeal of the public of the European countries and Russia to the president of Finland to organize an international conference in 2024 in the spirit of the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe. I decided to be a part of the NATO and not to be part of the NATO for the Finland after the conference. I'd like to invite you, Yuri, and you, Reiner, to participate in this conference. Maybe reasonable if it will organize in 21st of June, one day before the beginning of the so-called Great Patriotic War of the Russia, which is started in 1941. So that's all.
Thank you, Oleg, and thank you for the invitation. I think I saw Yuri's head, as I think we both will love to accept this invitation. Let me ask a second question to you. What do you think after the break of the old security order in Europe, after the end of all the arms control agreements in Europe, what could be the main steps for a new security order in Europe, and what could be the content of such a security order, or what will be the first next steps in this direction? Yuri, I give the floor again to you.
Of course, to achieve a new security order, we first of all need to make peace movement main actor. And I like ideas of Oleg Bodrov. Of course, press conferences and involvement of youth is very important. Also, I advocate an idea of creation of panel of experts to think and to work for peaceful settlement. Talking about youth, educating youth for peace and helping youth to uphold their rights, to not to go to army is important. We are cooperating with the Russian movement of conscientious objectors, and the European Bureau for Conscientious Objection organized a webinar in which we talked a lot about protection of human right to conscientious objection to military service. You know, peace movement should stop the war, advocate immediate ceasefire, comprehensive good faith peace talks, and worldwide transition towards nonviolent society. Peace movement should work for peace, build peace in politics and economy, uphold the human right to refuse to kill, because conscientious objection to military service is a foundation of peaceful way of life and future nonviolent society. Our first task is to take streets and online forums and say the truth, because truth is a first victim of war, and we should resurrect truth to stop the war. Peace should be built in our minds. People have a right to know that win-win is always better than win-lose, or quite frankly, to lose-lose, as usual in the outcome of any war, remembering all losses. We should shame and ridicule nuclear megalomania in the world politics, militant imperialisms and nationalisms. Moral outrage should be refocused from blaming the enemy to blaming great power politics, militarism, nuclear threats, and war profiteering. We can start from principle of common security, understanding that nobody can be safe endangering other. As a first step, the world needs comprehensive peace talks to find common ground, not only between Ukraine and Russia, but also between East and West. What sort of settlement can be achieved between Ukraine and Russia was discussed many times. A common point of all peaceful settlement ideas is neutrality of Ukraine and preservation of non-nuclear status. Territorial question is the most painful, and perhaps postponement of its resolution, some financial compensators and autonomy arrangements like in Minsk agreements could be helpful. But President Zelensky and Putin already abandoned Minsk agreements. So there is a lot of things to reframe. We need intellectual courage, first of all, to think about transition from the barbarism of permanent war to civilization of perpetual peace. Imagine the world without armies and borders. Imagine it. The world where nobody owns, but everybody share every territories, including disputed territories such as Crimea and Donbass, a world where peace belongs to everyone. Consider the alternative, the world where peace belongs only to great powers, and it is corrupted, unfair peace. no more than preservation of internal hierarchies of power and wealth at the cost of permanent fight between these great powers. Of course, this preservation of hierarchies of power and wealth, capitalism in permanent fight between the United States, China, and Russia will devastate European, African, and Asian battlefields. The last thing our poor, hungry, and heated world needs is another self-defeating Western crusade against its own reflection in the crooked mirror of geopolitics, enemy image of the East, which have almost nothing to do with reality. We should make a choice between future of hope and future of fear. Let's build fair and lasting peace forever.
Thank you, Yuri, for these encouraging words, and I give the floor to you, Oleg.
Again, I'd like to say thank you, Yuri, because I support all of your ideas, and it's very important to have such kind of the analysis. And from my point of view, I think what reason to do, like first step for such kind of the promotion. 1 year ago, we have international webinar with peace movement experts and activists from Scandinavian country, from Finland, Sweden, and other European countries. And the main idea was that reasonable, if we will involve to the peace process the regional politicians, regional non-governmental organizations, which is live and act on the coastline of the confrontation between NATO and Russia. The people who live very close of the line of the confrontation have very special motivation to be more active for the protection of the peace. And it is reasonable if these stakeholders will be more active and reasonable if International Peace Bureau and all activists from the peace movement will be part of this process. And it's not only my personal opinion. When I was a part of this international webinars, I involved the legislators from the Leningrad Oblast Legislative Assembly and from other municipal authorities. So they are ready to act, and we need to destroy the national monopoly for the peace or war. Now only presidents decided to continue war or to stop war. But if the regional politicians and regional stakeholders and NGOs will be part of this process, I think it will be more effective and it will destroy this monopoly. So this is my main message for you.
Indeed, we need to build peace together. Let's build peace together.
Yeah.
Thank you, Oleg. Thank you, Yuri. And I think to listen to your voices, we can look hopeful in the future that we can also solve this brutal war and come to a peace process which will really go to lasting peace. So thank you, Oleg and Yuri, for having time for this, to be a part of our important Vienna conference before the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons State conference happened. Thank you so much.
Of respect, we want to answer very, very shortly the question of the one from Brussels, my colleague from Brussels. Reiner will answer, and then I will give the floor to Mikaela for the closing word, and then this webinar, this conference is over. Thank you.
You let me say one sentence to this video. Both colleagues are under deep pressure in their country. Yuri wants to make this press conference he mentioned on the 22nd of June. He could not do it because of the internal power structure and the pressure he got from the local authorities. So we could only make this as an online event. You can see the answers we were preparing for the press conference on the IPB website. And the first webinar I made with Yuri was when there was a bombing in Ukraine, and he was sitting in his flat, and you can hear the noises of the bombing behind him. and he is under deep pressure in his work at the university at home. So I can only say these two colleagues and friends are really doing an encouraging work, and hopefully you can always support them from your work at home. They need our solidarity and they need our help for their fight, and this is really a very important part for me, for our peace work, for our international peace work. And I can only underline what my colleague was saying, international solidarity is to act together for peace. That is a short comment to the video. Let me answer shortly the question of Lugansk and Donetsk. I think the key point for me is that we need a ceasefire and a process of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, and moderation from Europe and other international organizations for finding a lasting peace in Ukraine. This includes neutrality. This includes a new constitutional discussion about a new constitution in Ukraine with sovereignty and federal rights for the different parts of Ukraine. And this includes security guarantees for all parts of the different sides in Ukraine. This is a long-term process which first of all needs to develop trust and discussions. And then we will see what will be the final results. Let's have in mind that this will be a long-term peace process which will not start today and will end tomorrow. But what we need is common discussions and solidarity actions of the people for coming to a ceasefire and peace process in Ukraine, which will definitely need a long term. So that is my answer to the challenge which we are facing in Ukraine.
I'm honored to have the last words, and they are in two aspects. There's one, Ulla talked about the satanic plan, so let's coordinate around a plan to save the planet, not to destroy the planet and take it to the underworld. One. So give it a look, it's online as well. Two is on this question of international solidarity, and I want to raise two examples. There's one, I will apologize from the African continent and the people's movements that we didn't coordinate with you on the Ramstein air bases. Because imagine how powerful it would have been if we had coordinated to protest in front of the Kotoka International Airport, where we're receiving aeroplanes directly from Germany, where an international airport gives us many opportunities because it's an international airport, and because it's not an official base, we have less security concerns. So that's one, is going forward, we can't miss these opportunities to coordinate, because we'll know about it, but we're not coming together in an organized fashion. So that's one. And two,
I think that is the first brilliant result of our discussion in the morning. We have a common action for next year.
For next year, perfect.
But don't forget Britain in the autumn.
Which I'm coming for Britain now. Is two is around this question of denuclearization. Does anyone know the word or have heard of the name Shinkolobwe? Yeah. Does that mean anything to people? Yeah. Those who know, raise your hand. Shinkolobwe. We have a few. Shinkolobwe is the uranium mine that most of the uranium that went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from Shinkolobwe in the DRC Congo. And so when we're talking about denuclearization, we have to fight, as Samara Machel was saying, same objectives on different terrains. So if we're building up, 6th of August is actually Hiroshima Day. We should be trying to coordinate our efforts where you are doing this terrain of denuclearization whilst we are organizing around the rampant exploitation of uranium on the African continent. Right? So going forward, I think these are two tasks. Maybe we won't have the same, Hiroshima is very close, 6th of August, but let us try to coordinate our efforts so that we aren't shooting our guns in different directions, but they're aimed towards the same enemy.
Shooting.
So that we're dousing the flames with the same amount of water, not sprinkling rain in different directions.
Wow, yeah. Nothing more to say.
Yeah, and on that note, everyone can go for lunch, right?
Yeah. We have a family picture, so maybe we can do a picture with the panelists and with all of us, and waving the peace flag. Very much for your attention.